The main issue with consequentialism, of course, is we can't know everything. Even if we had the time and resources, it's still impossible as we cannot tell the future. Life is messy. We can't ever get through life without doing harm. Some say to be concerned with things within our circle of influence and to keep it limited there. Perhaps as our circle of competence increases, so does our circle of influence. It seems to be the way of things. We've mentioned circles of competence before on the channel when we talked over Waitskin's book, The Art of Learning, Zen and the Art of Archery. That seems so long ago. These last 4 years, man, 2016. These have been dog years. 2020 is just like compressed time. I don't know what's going to happen after November the 3rd, 4th, after the election. It's going to be like a new era, despite the result. A lot of videos and interests and talk is going to evaporate overnight as the next 4 years is settled. Anyhow, I wanted to make mention again of Kant and his categorical imperative. A reminder not to use people as means to an end, but as ends of themselves, which basically boils down to treating people with respect, dignity, and accepting their autonomy. I can't resist. I want to say, yeah, but what about those people who are brainwashed and they've been subjected to propaganda? Is it really their autonomous and informed decision then that enables them to make their own decisions, or are they making someone else's decision in their own head? It's tempting, and we must, I suppose, be disciplined here, because people in desperate situations require help. Sometimes they ask for it, sometimes they don't. Sometimes they don't want help, but that's another tricky situation. And I've noted that people in desperate situations will sacrifice autonomy for safety, or even the promise of safety that we might be tempted to make to them. And that rationalised, it's a small step to horrible things. Interestingly, I've seen this trade-off used in police interrogations. Interviews. Yes, that's very PC. Another euphemism. Anything you can say can and will be used against you. Even things you don't say apparently is also now to be used again anyway. It seems this was more of an issue in the past when officers would make offers to people in desperate situations. Come on laddie, confess. I'll make sure your cooperation is noted. And I've had a word with the Sarge, and he reckons, if you tell the truth now, if you confess, you'll get a reduced sentence by half. 5 years is a long time, but if you confess, we'll only put it down for 12 months, max, for double murder. Yeah, right. So, police are generally prohibited from making such explicit offers, but they do come across as your friend, and only want to help. Funny how they always want to help when it's not invited. Well, if you really want to help, give me a Panamanian bank account, a Qatari passport, and a helicopter on the roof. What they mean is, I want to help you confess. I want to help you build a case against yourself. I want to help you talk your way into prison. I want to help me get promoted. Alright, funny games aside, I guess the advice here is to see the person as a person's circumstance, a person context, and perhaps, if anything, if invited, assist the person to change their circumstances in ways that they would like, not just what we can offer them. Of course, we can't grant what we don't have, but at least we've stopped to ask, and not to presume we either can't help, or that what we have is what they need. It might just not be so. And so far as murderers go, we can't have them running free. Again, there are exceptional circumstances, and that's what the courts are for. But I think it's more than a good rule of thumb to say that having murderers running around free in society is a bad thing, both from a virtuous point of view and from a consequentialist point of view. However, to deny someone their freedoms by locking them in a cage for 15 hours a day for 20 years is not a nice thing, and therefore we ought to be absolutely sure, or as the saying goes, beyond reasonable doubt, that that is appropriate. The so-called informed consent then, both in medicine and law, you are informed and you mix your choices. Ignorance, no defence and all that. How can you be ignorant of an agreement you agreed to be bound by? And acquiescence is agreement. Okay, so a bit of fun and jokes, informed consent and confessing to crimes and putting yourself in trouble by incriminating yourself. But it's another thing to be honest with yourself, and it's another thing to be informed to yourself. Too often we kind of hide behind euphemisms, and we use the euphemisms to justify doing things that we know that we shouldn't be doing and that we wouldn't normally do, but because we've renamed it something else, it doesn't really count. While the example I gave in the previous video of collateral damage is a very distanced language that describes killing of peoples that have nothing to do with the matter at hand or the conflict. And now, it's not technically murder because there's no directed intent at these innocents, but we, in the event of pursuing our military interests, are not naive enough to ignore the fact that innocent people are going to be killed. So this is where we check ourselves, and we've got to be honest and test ourselves as to our intent. Are we actually wanting the bad effect to come about but covering up by using a euphemism? I.e., it's not just a terrorist we want to take out, but it'd be good to take out a few of his friends as well, and we write that down to collateral damage, and then the whole operation is greenlit. We have to stop and say, are we actually doing this to take out a specific threat, or are we doing it just as an excuse to kill some of the people that we think something or other that will give us a good feeling? Have we exhausted all other options? In other words, if it's our extreme violence is our first choice, and then that should be an indicator that we haven't exhausted any other options. And if that's what we leap to first, we ought to be honest and hold ourselves accountable to the fact that we seem to have leaped to this desire for violence rather than actually a kind of really exhaustive approach to other options, which kind of tells us that it's what we actually want to do. There's a known and demonstrable terrorist on the run, and he or she, don't know whether that makes a difference to you, is armed and presumed dangerous. And the situation is so that we have a strong belief and very high confidence that they are an imminent threat to life. We know this person will be at the family home between 5 p.m. and 7 p.m, and at between 7:30 and 8 p.m, this person will be in the local town hall with possibly 100 people in attendance, after which we suspect this person will move on to do the planned deed. So we have a couple of missiles, a couple of drones. Where and when? The doctrine of double effect is a check against rationalising the path of by any means to justify the ends. Are there alternatives? In this case, might we have special forces in the area? If not, do we have someone's phone number? Even if it's the enemy side, we can ring them up and say, "Oi, we know you're going to do that thing at 7:30. We know you're in the family home right now. We've got a drone on its way. But if you leave in the next 15 minutes, and so long as we see you in this car heading north, we know that you're not heading south to do that thing, and then we won't bomb the family home." All right, the guy gets away. Well, he hasn't done the dastardly deed either. Funny how it was a guy as well. I kind of slipped into that, didn't I? The second test in the double doctoring effect is to check to ensure we're not using people as means. That, as deplorable as the current circumstance is, we must ensure we don't use another person, i.e., when we are disregarding someone's dignity, when we are disregarding their right to life, when we don't respect their autonomy, when we get them to act against their own desires in service of ours to cure our problem. This effectively means no unwilling participants. In other words, even using people by telling them things that aren't true to get them to do things that we want them to do that we know that they wouldn't do under a normal circumstance unless we give them disinformation or persuade, cajole or coerce them or threaten them otherwise. This one's done the rounds actually a little bit in the last few months, and I first heard it by a now ex-friend of mine. Well, it turns out he was a COVID-idiot. So he started spouting all this nonsense about the cure can't be worse than the disease. Well, we haven't got a cure yet. What was he talking about? You know, the vaccine for the COVID hasn't killed anyone. There is no vaccine. So Trump's tried this one on for size as well. But the way he says it, he can barely blather out the phrase. I wonder if he really understands the doctrine of double effect. It's a good test. Am I rationalising, wanting to actually do the bad thing myself? And this happens in purchases all the time. You want the red sports car because, well, you just want it. And then you go down the list. Well, actually, you say it only does 7 miles a gallon, but the literature says it does 20, so it's actually not that bad for the environment. You say it's impractical, but it does have a passenger seat that can be used in the rare occasion, to put the basket in there. And it does have a bit of a luggage compartment in the front, which is enough just to get, well, okay, not enough to get the weekly shopping, but all that means is we'll have to go shopping twice a week. So then we can have more choice about what we want on any given day rather than what we have left at the end of the week. See, it's all going to work out. And because we're going to have to make twice as many trips, we're really getting use out of it. See, it's wonderful. Character, virtues and vices. Are you honest enough? Do you have the integrity? It's a good quote. A man's character is his fate. I assume that applies to women too. Yeah, I think we could all be brilliant, but the opportunities and obfuscation of consequence have trapped so many. Have I mentioned the recruiters videos doing the rounds on the YouTubes, where it's a kind of current fad phase that someone has gone round with a mobile phone and interviewed cadets, new recruits and people in the Navy and in the Army, asking them what they thought of their recruiter. And the answer is, yes, scum, fucking liar, piece of shit, didn't tell me the truth. Bastard, never told me it'd be like this. Yeah, lied. You know, a lie by omission is still a lie. Yes, you'll travel the world. You'll get excellent training. The perhaps plus sides, but the downsides is you probably won't get to travel the world. You might get to see one place a lot. you might see a lot of the ocean, which looks pretty much like a lot of the other parts of the ocean. Or you might actually be below deck and not see any ocean for months on end. Man, those submariners. I don't know. Yeah, fascinating. Could be good. Alright, okay, let's try one. An example, a tricky one. You are an army commander. You are in foreign lands, tasked with the job at hand, and you send in helicopters over hilly terrain. Your helicopters keep getting shot down, and this is a puzzle. It's almost as though the enemy knows the helicopters are coming. You investigate, and you notice an elderly woman tending to her field, toiling the land by hand. She has no idea what's going on. She's not part of this. She's not involved in the conflict. But she is a curious person, and she's curious to these strange sounds that she hears from time to time coming from far away, from over the horizon. As the helicopter approaches, she stops her toil, stands up tall, looks to the sky to see what's causing the noise. And as she spots the small outline of the incoming helicopter, she pauses. The sun's high in the sky and it's a little bit glaring, so she covers her eyes with the palm of her hand to act like a shade so that she can make out the shape of these helicopters better. She looks at them for a moment, stares at them, and then goes back to her work. But you and your team are not the only ones watching her. The enemy, your enemy, have spotters all around in the jungle and in the lower lying valley, and they're watching her under jungle cover with binoculars. And they notice which way she looks when she stands up, hearing these strange noises, before she returns to tending her field. In effect, she is unwittingly indicating the direction of incoming traffic and giving away your boys' positions. Now she's inadvertently involved, not a combatant, not resisting, not actively fighting against you. But there is a causal link in the chain now, because the enemy are able to use her body language to have signalled to them the direction of incoming helicopters. What do you do? Well, in this particular case that was documented, the foreign force turned her to compost for her field. Grim. Now, would you classify that as collateral damage? There was something else I wanted to mention that I've fucking forgotten, but it's like a level of abstraction that the human mind can tolerate. So Alan Watts kind of used to joke about this a lot. I am who you think I am, and I think you are who I think you think that I am, that kind of thing. And there's this notion of triple character. We think, they think that we are who they think we are, that kind of thing. I think it gets about 5 levels deep, and then people start to lose it. So in conflict, he started it, she responded, but before that, this happened, and before that, this happened, and before that happened. So this is a response to that response, which is a response to this response, which is a response to that. It goes 5 level deep, and people start to lose track. I can't remember why I wanted to mention that or what it's called. So much I want to put in these things, and I forget. But it's just something to be on the lookout for. When people start doing this, it can be a tactic of distraction, but it can also be an important part of the puzzle that things have been missed out or forgotten because the description isn't full enough. And I remember at school, and I was very frustrated by this one. I still remember it. I was very young. We were making these little books. Basically, it was just a folded piece of brown paper with photocopies inside, held together by 2 punch marks through the appropriate place, bound with string ties. And so there were several steps in the process. Photocopy the songs for the book, fold the paper, put the holes in, and then you had to design a front cover and glue it on and then stick it all together. And the operation is that you'd make your book, and then at the last minute you'd stick your front cover on. Well, I was just about to stick my front cover on, and somebody else stuck their cover on the book that I'd constructed and stole it. And I looked at that and I didn't know how to handle that. It was kind of like the first notion I had of theft. I think I was only about 5 at the time. Part of my confusion was in acknowledging the problem of the burden of proof. How could I prove that this now complete booklet with somebody else's front cover glued onto it was actually mine that they'd stolen? How could I prove that? My word against theirs. I didn't have enough faith that the teacher would believe me. First of all, it's an outrageous claim to make, and second of all, it seemed outrageous and highly improbable that someone would actually do that anyway. So I concluded the teacher wouldn't believe my claim. And then forever after, the class was 1 book short. So when it came to song time, we'd get out all these books from the storage cupboard, and there'd always be 1 short, and the teacher would always huff and puff and like, well, why is there 1 missing? Why are we always 1 short? I knew the answer, but I couldn't express this thing that had happened. It was like, what's happened here? Someone's done something, and it's meant that something that I was constructing was appropriated. I didn't have the words to say appropriated or stolen or pinched or what. So often the times in conflict and negotiation, people don't know what's happened, can't express it. They just know that it doesn't sit right, but they can't express it. And then from the observer's point of view, what that looks like is they just got a stick in their arse over some issue that they can't explain, that they won't talk about, that they either refuse or can't talk about, which means that there isn't actually an issue, and they're just being a pain in the arse for no reason. Right. Rashomon effect. I think we mentioned that. Anyway, so for those who are interested in character and virtue and vice, I might put a link to a Google Docs document if I can be asked. But it lists out the vices and the virtues, and you can self-test yourself. Now, here's the thing. I'm not big on virtue. I'm, let's say, more consequentialist, INTJ type. What are you going to expect? The architect, of course, I'm going to be consequentialist. I think we mentioned already the default position, so it's the trolley problem. I'm sure you know, basic detail, trolley going down a rail yard, it's going to kill 5 people that are working on the track because this trolley's loose, it's heavy, weighs 50 tons, it's just going to squish them all. But if we pull the lever, the trolley will be diverted down a side track, and there's only 1 person working on that, and on that track, and it'll all likely to kill them. So do you pull the lever and kill 1, or do you not do anything, and in the default witness 5 accidental deaths? Do you have a moral imperative to act? If you do act and that 1 person is killed, are you culpable because you actually now took an active part in the process? Your actions had consequence. In the other scenario of not doing anything, your inaction has consequences that were going to happen anyway. Tricky one. So we'll get onto it when I get back to the main article. I'm still on a diversion. This is 9 part 2. But when it comes to war and top diplomats and presidents and war leaders, they all too often go with the default. They use this phrase, the die is cast, so it shall be, it's in the lap of the gods now. All these kinds of euphemisms for saying, I'm not going to do anything. I I don't want to make an active decision, but whatever the default happens, happens. And it's the same kind of thinking where we have to be on guard with in regard to virtue and vices. The idea, I don't know whether it holds water, but the idea is that if we are driven more by our virtue than by our consequence of action, then we ought to work on selecting the best virtues and practicing them so that we get good at them. And the notion is that if you don't practice at getting good at being virtuous, then you'll be run by your vices, the default positions. But it also carries a heavy weight too, because you shan't go unjudged. So if you select this path of being virtuous and don't work on being virtuous and fall victim to your vices, you are labelled weak-willed. Sorry. I don't make the rules, them's the rules. So the idea is that for any virtue, you can do it to excess, or you cannot do it at all and it becomes a vice. So I suppose the idea is to kind of hit the middle ground, to be a balanced person. And the idea is that if we practice being virtuous enough, after a while it becomes habit. Now I can't tell if that's true. The human context is a very complicated thing. We might, under some context, be able to exercise our virtue, but the cost might start increasing to a point where another virtue kicks in and supersedes. So then how do we reconcile the apparent, I don't know what you call it, conflict, deadlock? What's that words they use in database terminology where two processors are trying to access the same file at the same time and they both get a lock on it and it's like a deadlock. It's not contingency, I can't remember what they call it now. Anyway, whatever. So I think this is where they're saying everything or anything in moderation. I suppose it's the notion that we all have vices and we all have excesses, and it's the ability to govern or temper or limit or put a notion of control over these impulses. And it's something that we covered in the Francis Bacon episode, and it's I just find it amusing. This is where Francis Bacon is told by his friends that he drinks too much. So now what is he to do? Because they put him in a bit of a quandary. Because if he stops drinking at the stage when his friends tell him he drinks too much, is he stopping because he's relying on his friends telling him when to stop? Or is he stopping because he decided to stop? Well, the only way to know is to have one more beer. And then if you stop after that, you know that you stopped for yourself. Or have you? Or are you just saying, I'll have one more just to prove the point? And on it goes. Maybe I'll need to have two more then. Or maybe I'll need to get drunk and plastered, and then when I'm totally inebriated, if I can make the decision under that condition, I'll know I'm still in control no matter what, even if I decide to carry on drinking. It might be worth a reminder then to check out the STFU series, number 15 I think it is, Values, Conflict, Ambivalence and How to Resolve, and around about the 9-minute 30 mark, you'll see on the screen the kind of profiles of different types of conflict. Towards is an either-or decision. If you're faced with making an away conflict, it's the lesser of two evils, or you're between a rock and a hard place. And if you have an incongruent conflict, it's kind of fuzzy. It's a cyclic love-hate thing or a codependency. And maybe a quick refresher on STFU number 14, on certainty and the power of those who can bring certainty. Around about the 1 minute 20 second, I've put a grid on the screen. And I'll bring a slideshot up on the screen here, but in blue we have listed family, experience, life values, moralistic outlook and life purpose. These are themes of life. And in this exercise, these are presumed to have been chosen by the person going through this process. What's important to you? Well, family is important. What else is important? Experience. What else is important? My life values. What else is important? My moralistic outlook. And then you get them to rank and pick their top important themes for life. And then you say, okay, to experience a really good family life, or to develop notions of family, what choices can you do? And on the screen there, I've got choice A, choice B, choice C. And then you have them elicit different choices that they can do. And then this is kind of like building a risk sensitivity matrix. So which of those choices would allow you to fulfill the options that are available to you to actually be able to do that are within your means? Which one can you do that would activate or fulfill the notion of family experience or moralistic outlooks, life purpose? So you're basically connecting someone's mental hierarchy of things that are important to them down, and then you're going across on the actual practical things that they can actually do. Similar with this virtues, list of virtues you're interested in developing, and then right across ways, what are the things that you can do that will bring about it so that these are then habits, practiced, rehearsed. And a lot of the time, what seems to be is the resolution of conflict or the resolution of ambivalence. That is to say that, I want to have a good family experience in my life, but I also want to travel a lot on my own. Okay, so how do you resolve that? Which might not even be a case of which is more important, but is there a way that you can see to integrate both of those? Can you get a towards, or is it going to be an either or is it going to be an away from strategy? Are the things that are in one that you're moving towards? Are the things in one that you're moving away? Is it the other way around for the other thing? Can they be combined in a synergistic way so that you can travel with family, for example? And then there's the old classics in there. I want a satisfying job that I love to do, that I wake up for in the morning to go and do, that pays well. Yeah, rare. Usually it pays well for a reason, because either no one else is capable or no one else wants it. But you takes your risks, you takes your choices. And remember, kids, if you start to feel angry, it's a natural feeling created by unnatural thinking. So, when we're talking about virtues and ethics, morals and consequences, and the double doctrine effect, if we're getting frustrated and angry, it's probably because our thinking's off. We're thinking about things like revenge. It goes back to what I said previously, whereby, if you've gone round a neighbour's house and broken their windows, do they have the right to come round your house and break your windows? Does that move us anywhere? No, it just means two people have now got drafty houses and hate each other. The anger that precipitated or was brought on by unnatural thinking was, well, he's broke my windows, that makes me mad, I'm going to go around and smash his windows. Okay, great, what's been solved? I reckon the way to look at this virtues list then, and again, if I can be bothered, I'll put it in a Google Drive, is to consider it like a training for all circumstance, a risk matrix. What are the most likely challenges we're going to face in life? Train character for that. So it might be something like having respect for self and others, having fortitude and courage to do the things sometimes that we know we have to do but get put off by fear, but having the fortitude developed to be able to do it anyway. And that's why I was reminded of the values list. If you want to have a good life centered around family, then do things that satisfy those requirements. Make a list of the things that they might be, find out which ones are doable, find out which ones are within your circle of competence. Sure, stretch a little bit each time, get better at it. Same with virtues and character. Occasionally, we will be blindsided. Train for those too. But the odds of meeting the serial killer, or, that time that we always fantasize about being on the plane where both pilots are taken ill due to food poisoning. The autopilot suddenly has a fritz for whatever reason that we're called to action. And because we have 1,000 hours logged on Flight Simulator 10 or 11 or whatever, we're going to be the hero. No, so remote. Would be better off developing other virtues or tempering other vices. And as a word to the wise, may I humbly suggest, of course, the first virtue to get in check is wisdom. Of course. Yeah, I know. But it's things like serial killers, murderers, terrorists, plane crashes that have high emotional impact because of the heinousness and outrage. And in the case of plane crashes, the loss of so many lives at once. It stands out. It has high emotional impact. However, know that these are rare events, so rare that most people will never actually even know anyone involved in one, let alone be directly involved. Yeah, okay, you know someone who knew someone in the trade towers, 6 degrees of separation and all that. Is it still 6? I think we're down now, aren't we? Are we down to 4 yet? On Facebook, I think it was 5.2 in 2008, 4.7 in 2011 and 4.5 in 2016. And I think the average on Twitter is consistent with that at 4.6. And digging in a bit closer into the data, I actually found out that 50% of Twitter users are actually at 4 degrees of separation. Anyway, tune the perception filters and become sensitive to what actually matters. But then I'm biased, and as I think we know, to a consequentialist position. However, do it with virtue. Train the brain to have those qualities, more, whatever. It's been said so many times, it's beyond cliche. How well do you know yourself? See quotes by Churchill and Alan Watts, virtues, vices test, etc., etc. So this leads into the question, who do you surround yourself with, and who are you being a friend to? And it's a similar question of who we put into Supreme Courts. You can't get away from character, and therefore bias. I showed in episode number 7 one model of many, which is the kind of Star Trek model. I know it's fantasy, it's film, but remember that's written by human beings that have noticed things. It doesn't make it right, it's just a model. The model whereby you have a commander with virtue who's able to apply balance, and he consults with his executive board who have a mix of virtue, logic, reason, consequentialism, utilitarianism, deontology, and other principles that are worth discussing. End of the day, the captain makes the choice. But the captain has the wisdom to realise that he's limited by his own perceptions, he's limited by his own understandings, and he's limited by his own bias. Therefore, he's compelled to ask those whose fates perhaps he shares, but who would offer different choices, different options, and things to consider that perhaps a good captain hadn't previously thought about. That's what they're there for. And this is why I puzzle the likes of Trump and the likes of Boris Johnson. I always imagined that President, Prime Minister would be one of the easiest jobs in the world. Just whatever the office needs, it gets. Right, we've got a problem. Good, right, get me the world's top 10 experts by here by the end of play tomorrow, and let's see what they think they can do with this. Why do I have to get involved? It's the captain all over again. All right, I might have to make the final decision, but let's bring in the experts. Why do I have to work it all out? But of course, the interesting thing about Star Trek, we'll come on to Star Trek a bit more, is that throughout the program, the show, I'm sure you know, is the notion of the Prime Directive that prohibits interference of civilizations that are deemed pre-warp. I think the notion behind that is that civilizations that haven't got to that fantastical point yet it's too big a jump to move them from pre-warp to post-warp civilizations, and the story goes that it always ends in disaster. I don't know what that's based on. I don't know whether that's necessarily true. In the show, though, it's portrayed that the personnel on board are there by voluntary action, I presume with informed consent, and I presume agree to the chain of command. Therefore, the agreement to be guided by such authority is by agreement, not by power dominance. And then to mistake the power of the executive with the wisdom of the executive, it's not the same thing. The wisdom of the executive board to which decisional power consult is much wider in scope and experience. Again, it's almost inconceivable that the mind, the brain, your experiences, it's almost overwhelming keeping track of everything you know and everything you've experienced. Imagine doubling that. And that's just to make space for one other person's life experience. I imagine a room full of 10 experts in their chosen field. Cram that in your mind and pretend that that's what you did with your life. It's just overwhelming. Making a good decision is one thing. Executing on a decision someone else made is another. The accepting caveat, of course, is that someone else has done the due diligence, or the analysis actually been completed, or the ethical considerations have actually been undertaken, albeit by somebody else. But in the sense that they did it, they told me to do it, I take no responsibility, I was just copying what those others did. If it's good enough for them, it's good enough for us. Even if that works out well, it's not ethically derived. And I've heard Trump harp on about, well, watch the news, any of those Republicans who are asked about the coronavirus and their response, they always say, yes, but look at Europe. Yes, but look at Japan. Yes, but look at anywhere else. It's like, well, what's that to do with the United States? It's a different place, different circumstance, different resources. Their plan might not match yours. And this is a crazy thing. I remember when my dad taught me to do driving. He said, do not play follow the leader. Their car performance might be different than yours. Their brakes might be better. Their acceleration, the performance of their car might be different to yours. They might actually have seen the road was clear and that they thought that they could make it, but it doesn't mean that you will too. So don't blindly follow the leader. Make your own decisions. It may also be that you're following a suicidal maniac. Speaking of power dominance and dignity and autonomy, before getting into more on character, virtues and so on, Again, I've promised to cover this book as well, Wiseman's book on discrimination by design. And there's much talk at the moment about institutional racism. These architectural design structures, not literally just buildings, but everything else, the superstructures of power, all contribute to this idea of institutional racism. I mean, I mentioned in a couple of videos about how redlining was banned or made illegal, but these edicts by tweet that Trump's making about giving the suburbs back and reversing the decisions on building affordable housing in wealthy areas is effectively redlining again. Anyway, yeah, there is this notion that women aren't funny. I see this trope doing the rounds. It's done the rounds in the last few years. I only mentioned it here. I was just reminded, back at school, the slut shaming that went on. Not that any one of them was a slut, whatever one of those is, but that didn't matter. If there were no sluts to shame, a poor girl was labelled one anyway, and then it became de facto. Guys had free rein to be funny, and I suspect many did so in the vain hopes of being liked, especially by the young Womsers. But if a young Woms or girl went out of her way to be funny, she was punished for it, put down on the spot, shunned and slut-shamed for good measure. Again, it's like there was an entitlement to attention, and even in my Gen X early days, legacy notions of seen and not heard still lingered, especially with the young Womsers. So if a girl got attention from doing good schoolwork, the attention had to be usurped. It's the rules. She's a swat, little misdoing, bookworm, teacher's pet. If she got attention by being funny, again, the attention was usurped. She was ugly and not funny, and then put down and slut-shamed anyway. Sad. But in my school, only a couple of the girls were actually smart, and don't misconstrue what I'm saying. My school wasn't for the smart kids. There really were only 4 smart kids I remember in my year. 2 smart girls, my best mate James, who's no longer with us, and naturally myself. I won the school prize for our best exam results, so there it's evident it was official. Anyhow, the young girls who were picked on as being Miss Goody Two Shoes or teacher's pet, because they were pretty smart, started to take up smoking to shake the image. So 13, 14-year-old takes up smoking to deflect the fact that she's smart. Brilliant. Yeah. So if a girl was funny and, traditionally good looking, she was a floozy. Yeah, there's just no winning for them. Being funny puts you at the centre of attention somewhat. No. It can't be the role a woman can command. We all know that seats of power and attention is for men. And changing that, back then, a woman in power, that was an aberration. Weird, unnatural, perverse. Hence, slut, ugly, fat and lazy, whatever. Yeah, it's really weird how women were put down, which is really sad when you think about it, because I reckon all the guys are trying to be funny and smart to stand out to impress the Womsers anyway. It's projection, isn't it? It makes the game suddenly transparent. So that's maybe one reason Womsers are discouraged by torment and put down when they try to be funny. It still goes on, even in adult and professional levels. Recently, as it happens, Pure Chance came across a documentary about Not the 9 O'Clock News, which was a 1980s, 1990s satire, dark comedy series on TV. Not my thing. I never really got it. No, I was really into Monty Python either, and Hello, I just found sad. Are You Being Served? Yeah, only because there was nothing else to watch. Kenny Everett, Benny Hill, I really didn't like that. Even back then I got creepy, chauvinistic vibes from it. Same with the Paul Hogan Show. Absolutely fabulous. I liked Blackadder in small doses. I never watched Father Ted. Friends raged about it. Not my thing. Heidi High hated it. Just the aspiration, the low aspiration of it. I'm Alan Partridge. Never watched it. Don't know what that was about. Rising Damp, brilliant. Red Dwarf. Everyone has the guilty pleasure. The Office. Never ever seen a full episode. Clips, of course. The Young Ones. Well, the revolution seemed possible back then. Yes, Minister. Well, that's hardly a comedy now, is it? It's more documentary. Ali G. Yeah, of course. Spitting image. But anyway, Not the 9 O'Clock News. I never saw it first time around. Perhaps I've only seen clips. Though, of course, we all came to know Pamela Stephenson in Superman 3, and she married Billy Connolly. Anyway, around that time, Rowan Atkinson made a documentary attempting to cover the production of and the story behind Not the 9 O'Clock News. I think he was making a film or a documentary about the Not the 9 O'Clock News or something, and it ended up being 90 minutes long, and it not included in that a single clip of Pamela, someone who he'd worked with for years. Very strange. When asked about it, he said, yeah, well, I didn't think she was very funny. Well, most of it was script written by someone else anyway, which makes it even weirder. And I will point out that in making that kind of content, it's not made to be bought by the producer, but made for the consumption of people who like not the 9 o'clock news, who are interested and like, presumably, the characters in it, because that's what they watch it for, aka fans of the show. So why he thought it was a good idea to cut out a third of the cast, well, why indeed. But Jesus Christ, go online, it's a shit show. I used to do a little bit of periscoping, and 100% of the time, when a woman was live streaming, it was an endless text torrent of shit about do this, do that, demands to see the boobage, I'm going to do this to you, I'm going to do that to you. Endless. Yeah, I know now why those block buttons are useful. And even if you show a bit of sympathy and solidarity and empathy for this kind of, what should we call it, gender abuse, sexual discrimination, just putting people down because they were born different genitalia. What do you get? Are you simping, bro? Are you simping for that girl? Are you simping, bro? See, it's the plead for attention again. I think a while ago, in one of the videos I mentioned how Max Factor came about, that he had this device that's basically an anxiety installation device that showed women their faults. Not actual faults, but deviations from the average measurements, which, ironically, and in a grotesquely pitiful way, don't actually exist, but is the benchmark to which to aspire. And because average doesn't exist, everyone will never measure up to it. But never mind, we can sell you face paint that makes it look as though you can. Anxiety about the way others see you. Wow, nice one. So again, WOMS gets it on both sides. Slightest imperfection or zit, mocked endlessly, but beautiful, well-kept, and looked after themselves, mocked again as a slut or stuck-up bitch. Especially after turning down the 20th approach of the day or the 100th dick pic. It's just fucking endless. And there are forums, Reddit groups and fan pages that actually have 18th birthday countdowns for their celebrity of desire. It's bizarre. Yeah, they will count down the days until their fantasy turns 18 and then it becomes legal. I shit you not. Yeah, constant undermining of confidence. And to my shame, when I was younger, I did it too. Careless phrases that I thought were funny, but only because I'd seen another bloke do it and they laughed. And male solidarity tells you that it's funny to do that, which again reveals a lack of awareness, which is what all this is about, and the lack of ability or empathy to even look to the feelings and needs and dignity that's been violated of the subject or victim of these put-downs. I remember doing it casually, not to any great extent. I mean, the occasional once or twice in like 10 years. But that's the thing, that I didn't mean it. I wasn't being deliberate about it. It was just an off-the-cuff thing that, in retrospect, looking back on it, caused an immense amount of damage. The fact that it doesn't even figure in the contemplation that the actions are seen as funny becomes a programmed response to just do it for the lols. And I suspect there's the same with a lot of racism. And I commented before that I don't think a large proportion of minor racist incidents are necessarily deliberately vindictive, but that genuinely the perpetrator just doesn't see that what they're doing is wrong, that what they're doing is the very definition of racism. They just don't see it. And don't get me wrong, that's no excuse. It has real effects. It is destructive, it is harmful, and made more the worse for the fact that the cost to the casual, passive perpetrator to refrain from doing these things is zero. It comes back to virtues and character, and the question of how much time we've spent just improving our awareness of other people's situation, just improving a little bit of empathy, just expanding our awareness of things, that we don't get our kicks by putting other people down, that our gratification has to come at the cost of another. Why I find it sad is because the distress and sadness and anguish that's caused is 100 times more than the 2 minutes effort of self-reflection and self-restraint it would take for the people who do this to realise they're doing it because of outdated models, outdated mental models, outdated cultural artefacts, learned parental behaviour that they've never re-evaluated, and they've learned this mimicry from arseholes who once upon a time they looked up to, but even the arsehole has now grown up. Again, it's perplexing that the Catholic South has more progressive views and regulation towards abortion than the Protestant North. Another example. The Irish branch of the Catholic anti-abortion group Human Life International. The director of Human Life International criticised the contraceptive mentality and claimed this leads directly to abortion. Gonna have to walk me through that logic. Human Life International was founded by Father Paul Marks, hereinafter referred to as HLI. Father Paul Marks, no longer with us. The current director of HLI has quoted the founder, Paul Marks, in stating that in every country, bar none, contraception has led to abortion, and abortion to infanticide, and infanticide as the prelude to full-blown euthanasia. I don't know, I think contraception's available in just about every country now, and I don't know that every country has full-blown euthanasia. He went on to say, once the purposes of sex are torn loose from procreation and family, the homosexual agenda arises. He said, Father Marks had said this because contraception is the first step. I can certainly speak for myself, having protected fucks for years. Not so much recently, don't feel sorry for me, but I haven't felt the gay rising within as a consequence. He went on, if contraceptive sex is okay, if infertile sex is okay, if sterile sex is okay, there's only one more step to go to say homosexual sex is fine too. What a fucking ridiculous, stupid set of assumptions and slippery slope arguments. Well, not arguments, slippery slope logical fallacies. Informal logical fallacies. Neither valid nor cogent. I hope I don't have to point out the ridiculousness of this assumption. I won't credit calling it an argument because it starts off with a weaselly if and proceeds with another if and a third if. So I'd just like to explicitly draw attention to this kind of construct. In one of the earlier videos in this series that I'm doing on science, philosophy, logic, war, reason and conflict, I introduced some really basic formal logic and the construction of valid and sound arguments. A very basic form was where we have two premises and a conclusion. But this argument is very different. If contraceptive sex is okay, morally acceptable, a subjective judgment. If infertile sex is okay, happens all the time, therefore must be okay. If sterile sex is okay, what even is sterile sex? Then there is only one more step to go to say homosexual sex is fine too. It's not really a valid argument because the form is broken. It has the words of premise and the words of an argument, if, then, but doesn't explicitly state in any useful way if, then, what. If contraceptive sex is okay, well, what does okay even mean here? People do this without harm to themselves. If what is meant is that it harms the yet to be conceived, then this is also a flawed argument. It's like complaining about the 100 million lottery win that you never won because you never bought a ticket. Next is listed another if statement. Is this related to the first in a causal chain? It doesn't appear to be. If infertile sex is okay, according to whom or what, happens all the time, it's the way of nature. And then he just carries on. If sterile sex is okay, again, now we're having a third condition listed with no causal link to the previous statement, and it kind of just lingers on its own. It's like a half sentence. It's incomplete. So you can see how the series of statements tries to imply a logical sequence. Contraception, infertile, sterile, homo. These concepts are not related to each other. I might as well say, if bread on the table and soup is okay and eating is okay, then it's okay to say fasting is fine too. Alright. Explain that. It makes no sense. Fasting stands on its own. Whether it's okay or not okay, is a matter of investigation. But is it okay to say fasting is okay? That's what's being implied. In fact, this rhetoric is worse because it makes a wishy-washy assertion that given the 3 previously listed moralistic appeals, then there is only one more step to go. Well, which is what? Because he didn't actually say that either. But because this sentence is long and has lots of clauses, we lose track. It's a disingenuous trick. It uses the if-then construct, but in a non-valid way, kind of like, if this, then it's only one step to say that. Well, no, you can just come out and say that, whatever it is, without any previous limitations on logic or reason. You can just come out and say anything you want. So he's merely saying that it's just one step to say homosexuality is okay. You don't need any steps. You can say it's okay. You can say it's not okay. It doesn't make it true, but you can say it. This is the thing I mentioned earlier, the he said, that she said, that he said, that was said in response to what he said in the first instance. People lose track. The good father here has tried to hoodwink us by offering an if and an if and an if. Then there is only one more step to say something or other. It's by nesting 3 deep and then adding in one more step. It's a linguistic slide to distance from what has just been said to trick us to accept the notion that there is only one more step, because it would be ridiculous to say, there are 5 more steps. The listener now would stop and say, okay, what are those 5 things? Convince me. And you've stated there are 5 things, so now I'm expecting to hear 5 justifications for each one. The slide doesn't pull through. The claimant now has to explain all those 5 things. And the listener, of course, is curious when you phrase things in that kind of way. There's just 5 secrets to blah, 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 whatever. But with only one step, we can get people to accept it without too much grief. Just consider. Hey, would you help me do a small favour today? Sure. Hey, would you help me with 6 favours today? Okay, well, what are they? It's actually even worse than that, though. The father here he's not even making an explicit claim about the morality or consequence of any of these such actions. He's merely saying it's one step to say homosexuality is okay. Like I say, I can make that statement without any conditional predicates or antecedent premise. I can say any bloody foolish thing that passes through my mind. It might not even be correct or truthful either. I can just say it. Now, notice that whether homo is okay or not has been skipped. The question has been sidelined to the notion of merely saying homosexuality is okay or not. I'll come back to that in a minute. So does the father mean that he thinks it's okay to say such things, regardless of morality, regardless of rightness or wrongness? It's all about what we can and can't say, or it's just one step to be able to say these things. I've left out of this an analysis of whether homosexuality is okay or not. The father likewise dodges this issue. Come back to it in a minute. He says nothing, nor offers any argument as to why an act of sex is or is not moral, or right or wrong. He does not define sex either. He doesn't define what okay is. I might presume he means sex is between a man and a woman, and in the prescribed way. And he may have a notion that anything else is not even sex, but some abominable act. Now, maybe I presume too much, but this is it with its obfuscated and disingenuous rhetoric. These assumptions are inferred and almost kind of baked in, but conveniently left out of being explicitly stated. Why? Adding in my own interpretation and what I know of original sin, I think the idea here is that all sex is defined as immoral, and that only where it creates offspring is it actually sex. And in that way, it's kind of like not a sin, it's forgivable, thus making it a moral act. Therefore, any act that involves the sex organs, let's say, that does not serve a function of procreation is not actually sex, but a depraved act. This is what has to be true for the father's words to make sense. Sense in the context of him saying them, but not sense in the form of valid argument. It might be cogent reasoning, but based on assumptions and assertions about this thing called sin. Now, whether this is true or arguable, I really think it's indefensible. But the father has been a little dishonest in presuming that we accept this apparent axiom of original sin. It would be more honest of the father to say as such that, according to doctrine, any sex without procreation is a sin. In a modern world, this sounds like what it is, an ancient superstition and a desire to impose control on people on the presumption that they are ignorant, incompetent, or otherwise unable to come to these conclusions. Hence, the leap to the last refuge of control. I don't know if I'll get to the philosophy of law, but my naive position is that this is a device for the people, by the people. It's an agreement that we make to kind of like get along, and to use the law to enforce adherence to illusions, delusions, and magical sky daddies, whereby failure to adhere would see you locked up in a cage, is an abuse of the law. That aside, the if statement in the father's rhetoric form a non sequitur. The conclusion does not follow from the previous statements. The statements are actually if statements, which classifies this rhetoric as a complicated hypothetical contingency, and those contingencies are actually, I don't know, it seems like a slippery slope, or perhaps even special pleading. If A, if B, if C, then one step to say D. So I don't know if it's deliberately disingenuous to construct assertions that rely on this 3 or 4 or 5 deep if statements. If this, if that, if the other, and if the third or fourth, and the fifth, and if the sixth, then. Well, okay, but it doesn't mean any of them are true. It doesn't support the premise. Any of them. It may be a valid form to say if this, and if that, and if the other, and if the next, and if the last, then something, logically that is, I suppose, a valid form. But as to whether any of the premises contained in those if statements is actually true, well, we've just kind of glossed them all over, and by the time we've got to the last one, I can't even remember what the first one was. So it makes it difficult to challenge, because there's a lot to remember. I actually saw a really good demonstration of this just recently on an online debate where someone wanted to do some quite disingenuous argumentation. So they quoted a rather long and convoluted paragraph from a book, and the paragraph pretty much was of this construct. Given that this, and supposing that that's true, and that what so-and-so said was in line with this argumentation that was a quote from an earlier person who used historical analysis to derive the fact that he'd based his work on something that he had read, would you agree with the book? What? Well, what else does the book say? So you're disagreeing with the book then? Well, I don't know what the book... So, well, it's either a yes or a no. You either agree or you don't. That kind of false dichotomy. Really disingenuous. Sucky. Besides, in our discussion here of how contraception leads to homosexuality, it's a bit of a big jump. It's a huge leap that's required in that last step. He has to get from sterile sex being okay to, say, homosexuality is fine too. I don't get the causal link here. I mean, firstly, it seems that God, if it exists, has made some humans incapable of having children. So by this logic, God is for the homo too? Regardless, why is the notion of homosexual sex being fine predicated on anything other than the consent of those involved? Again, with the insistence on controlling people. Rather than just come out and say it, I don't like homosexuality, it frightens me and makes me nervous and anxious because I have repressed feelings, they insist on this incoherent mumbo-jumbo, and it seems to me that they do it to distract, to make it very difficult to have cogent conversations, that they don't want actually a cogent response, they just want to patter their rhetoric and blather on. And again, it's the same tactic that Trump uses in those tweets that we talked about a couple of episodes back, where you put such distance between your original point and the outrageous claim at the end that it leaves people bewildered. They don't know, I can't even remember how they started. What were we arguing about all of a sudden? Meanwhile, they spent the last 15 minutes spewing their rhetoric to anyone who will listen. Abortion is a grave sin, said another. The sex word was virtually not spoken in the entire debate in the Republic of Ireland. What he means is that sex is to be viewed solely as an act of procreation. This person went on. So when people went to the polls, they didn't hear that word, and to some degree they can't be held culpable for what they didn't know. Perhaps he assumes too much, and this is his projection. He assumes that, 1, people were ignorant that he sees sex as a sin, and 2, that had people realised this, they too would have reached a similar conclusion on abortion, which may not be the case. The argument is sex without procreation is a sin, therefore abortion should be outlawed, because having the child then disqualifies what otherwise would be a sin. You know, I joked about it a couple of episodes back, this notion of cock-blocking God. Anything that gets in the perceived way of God is a cock-block and a sin. And I have to say, you know, if such a powerful deity is so easily blocked and upset by trivial matters, he's not so powerful after all. Perhaps the person making these claims doesn't share the position of those who did vote on this issue. Perhaps they did hear the S word, but saw things differently. Because the vote went against the HLI, they then bring up this rhetoric of foul play insofar as, had the voters known that sex without producing children is a sin, then people would have voted otherwise. He then went on and said that had they done so, people would have voted from an informed position. He said, giving them the truth forces them to make a choice for God or against God. What he means by informed is hoodwinked by a false dichotomy. Yeah, the old with us or against us rhetoric. It's disingenuous. It's worse than that. Giving them the truth? It's just so reprehensible. First, the preposition that God needs people to choose him at all. Well, that being granted, if it exists, of which there is no evidence, all this is fantasy land stuff anyway. This was a horrid strategy many years ago when you really did put your life in danger when denouncing the existence or denouncing the mind of God. Then, to control people, all you need to do is assume a powerful position in the multi-level marketing machine known as the church and make proclamation that this or that is God's will and anyone who disagrees doesn't believe in God. Which is a flawed argument anyway. One might still believe in the deity existing, but question said mind of said deity. But anyway, once smeared as God-denying, seems one's fate was sealed. The truth is, in this example, God is taken on faith. God's intent is taken at face value by those who imagine to know it, and it is assumed that ancient texts are reliable when, time after time, specific claims about the natural world made in those sacred texts, which can be tested, have been tested, and the claims in those ancient texts have been shown to be wrong time after time. It's rich to me that an institution based on lies, ignorance, and a faith that denies evidence has the audacity to talk about the truth. Oh, and the cover-ups of child rape as well. Reduced to a dichotomy constructed such that the speaker assumes that their virtues match with those they are trying to convince, such that people don't wish the public humiliation of being called a sinner and thereby opt for the non-sin route and by tacit compliance opt for the God route. Normally, where our values don't match or we have different virtue hierarchies, we can still part as friends, having negotiated an agreement regardless. But as soon as I declare my virtues are precisely aligned with Scripture or a God, and if yours do not match mine, then by definition you are lesser, a sinner, against God. I think this supports my notion. In such cases, it's all about appearance of virtue over consequence, and that the personal rights and individual circumstance and autonomy not only seem to be irrelevant to those with the mindset of both the father and the other advocates cited in the previous example about banning abortions. The second advocate in the example went on. He said, we in Northern Ireland are now being faced with that choice, and I believe that we can change the psyche of this province back to God to stave off this threat. Threat? What threat? He didn't elaborate except to say those in Northern Ireland were a stubborn lot. Perhaps by threat he meant free-thinking citizens. Perhaps by stubborn he meant resilient to religious bullshit. Or perhaps he's just scared of the homo. And, as mentioned on the channel many times, and as a few police interrogators know, and, for that matter, good copywriters know, the how and the why are critical to any narrative. So I would ask the person who said these things, the second advocate in this story, how does changing the psyche back to God stave off threats, and why is that a preference, and a preference to who and why ought that preference take precedent over any other? How is it justified? It's a little bit of a similar question to why should human life be given precedent over any other organism's life? Yes, I know, but Why? Convenient to say, because God said. And then when you say, yeah, but that's not really an argument, well, then obviously you don't believe in God. You heretic. Let's burn you at the stake. And that is how that happens. All right, enough. We'll continue in a little bit. I'm trying to keep these to about an hour.